assistance needs to safely reach those in need. And we encourage all to support the GHF's efforts. President, in closing, the United States calls upon all countries to join together and say with one clear voice that Hamas must immediately surrender, release all the hostages, both those living and those who have already been murdered at the hands of Hamas, and allow this war to end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And also we thank Assistant Secretary General Jenča for his briefing, and we acknowledge the presence of Foreign Minister Saar and the permanent representative of the State of Palestine in the meeting. We thank Eli David for sharing his deeply personal testimony. The images of your brother, Avatar, which were published days ago, are simply horrifying. And we feel and we share the pain, unbearable pain of your family. We strongly condemn Hamas and Islamic Jihad for their cruelty towards the hostages. All images coming from Gaza these days of hostages and of malnourished children shock us to our core. They remind us of the unacceptable suffering of civilians 1 year and 9 months into this war. And our public keeps asking what else needs to happen in Gaza for the world to move and stop this war. Slovenia reiterates today its call for the immediate, unconditional and dignified release of all hostages. This has been our call from the beginning. International law is clear. Hostages taking is prohibited. Using their starved images as propaganda is simply barbaric. We once again condemn the heinous acts of Hamas and other terrorist groups of October 7. While in captivity, all hostages must be afforded humane treatment. They must receive the medical care and attention they so desperately require, and the ICRC should be granted immediate access to them. Colleagues, recognizing the suffering of the hostages does not diminish the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and vice versa. Recognizing the suffering of Palestinians does not diminish the suffering of the hostages. The suffering of all civilians caught in this war is intolerable. The humanity of the 21st century and this Council should not allow this type of inhumane treatment to continue. Mr. President, deliberate starvation is unlawful and morally unacceptable, wherever it happens and whoever perpetrates. All parties have obligations under international humanitarian law, and yet in Gaza, these obligations have been systematically and gravely violated with devastating consequences. We must be honest about the reality of the situation on the ground, and my Pakistani colleague has already quoted the IPC panel, which just last week raised an alarm that the worst-case scenario of famine and humanitarian catastrophe is unfolding before our eyes. Israel is obliged to facilitate humanitarian aid. Instead, the months-long Israeli blockade has led us to a point of moral outrage. We see with our own eyes how the vulnerable are suffering. Children, older persons, persons with disabilities, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and hostages. No one is immune. Small improvements and public proclamations of humanitarian pauses are way past due and simply not enough. We demand immediate, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance at scale to the population of Gaza. The UN and humanitarians must be able to do their life-saving work safely and securely. They have proven that they can deliver if only they are allowed to do their job. We also appeal once again for the establishment of a corridor to facilitate medical evacuations of patients from Gaza to hospitals in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Mr. President, each human being has inherent dignity and value. In the midst of tragedy and chaos, we must never allow ourselves to deny the human element of this crisis. Names like Evatar David and Rom Braslavsky should not go unspoken or be forgotten in this chamber. Neither should names of children like Hind Rajab, killed while pleading for help, and Mahmoud Aijur, who lost both arms. And many names we may never know. Countless lives destroyed, countless lives lost. As the father of one hostage powerfully said, in a competition of pain, there are no winners. We recall how during the ceasefire early this year, we witnessed scenes of hostages being reunited with their families, of aid at scale moving through crossings, of Palestinian children returning to school, of families returning to their homes, even if only rubble was left behind. We hold on the hope that this can once again become a reality. We need an immediate ceasefire and an end to the suffering of hostages and civilians alike. Slovenia urges all parties to recommit to ceasefire talks. Slovenia firmly rejects any plans to expand military operations in Gaza, which would seriously endanger civilians, including hostages, and compound the humanitarian catastrophe. There is no military solution to this suffering. Experience has shown that it brings us no closer to peace, freedom, or security for Palestinians or for Israelis. A lasting ceasefire must be secured. A ceasefire gives desperate relief to all in Gaza, living under relentless bombardment. A ceasefire brings hostages home. A ceasefire puts food on tables. And a ceasefire provides space for a political horizon towards a two-state solution. We must renew our demand for a ceasefire now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenca for his briefing, as well as Mr. Eli David for his powerful and moving testimony. And I express my deep sympathy for the suffering you, Mr. David, and other relatives of hostages have endured. I would also like to welcome the presence of His Excellency Mr. Gideon Sar, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, to this meeting, as well as of the representatives of the Observer State of Palestine and Argentina. Mr. President, Greece reiterates its firm condemnation of the heinous terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on October 7. The recently released images of hostages were yet another stark reminder of this continuing calamity. Today, we stand in solidarity with the victims and the families, and above all, with those who remain in captivity. Our thoughts are with every hostage still held in Gaza, with those who returned home traumatized, with those who perished in captivity, and those whose fate remains unknown. We once again demand their immediate, unconditional, safe, and dignified release. They must be released now. It is deeply troubling that these hostages have not been granted humanitarian access to address urgent medical and basic needs as required under international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, in the months that have followed the appalling events of October 7, the members of the Security Council have been discussing and debating over the situation in the Middle East and specifically in the Gaza Strip as events unfolded and a disastrous humanitarian situation took hold of the entire Strip. The world has witnessed violence surging and people agonizing over the future of their loved ones. It has witnessed starvation and death. Unfortunately, as we continue to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, a feeling of frustration, of a peace that remains elusive, is ever prevalent. We have repeatedly condemned the atrocities of October 7. We have made clear that Hamas has no place in the day after in Gaza. We have called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We have joined the calls of our fellow members of this Council for a ceasefire and for humanitarian aid to be delivered massively, immediately to Gaza. We have called on Israel to lift the blockade and spare the starving population. Mr. President, we cannot accept the suffering and humiliation of the hostages at the hands of Hamas and the anguish of their families. No one should. Nor can we turn a blind eye to the suffering of over 2 million Palestinians and their strive to survive. The toll is staggering: thousands dead or injured, countless displaced, and a population struggling daily for survival. In this regard, we call on all parties to show responsibility and opt for an agreement, as it is evident by now that this conflict has no military solution. The political process must be revitalized with the aim to create conditions conducive to achieving a two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolutions, while guaranteeing the right of Israel to exist in peace and security. As we have stressed before, there can be no day-after scenario for the Gaza Strip with Hamas. There can be no day-after scenario without the Palestinians in Gaza. Forced displacement of the population from the occupied Palestinian territories would amount to a grave violation of international law, would jeopardize the regional stability and security, and would undermine the prospect of a two-state solution, as would any other actions that run counter to this objective. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis on the ground demands immediate action. Millions are in urgent need of food, primary health services, education, and shelter. Border crossings must remain open. UNRWA's role should not be undermined. Civilians and humanitarian workers must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we cannot change the past, but we can certainly shape the future. The suffering of both sides must come to an end. Neither the hostages and their families nor the Palestinians can afford another day of this devastation. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, this meeting provides yet another opportunity for the Council to respond to the multifaceted catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. I acknowledge the participation in today's meeting of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, His Excellency Gideon Sa'ar, the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine, His Excellency Riyad Mansour, and a representative of Argentina. I thank Assistant Secretary General Yencha for the updates and Mr. Eli David for his bravery in sharing his story with the world. No one should be forced to experience any of the horrors taking place in Gaza, and Guyana commiserates with Mr. David and his family. Indeed, Mr. David's account reminds us of the wanton degradation of human life that has persisted since October 7th, and even before. This must be utterly rejected by the international community and brought to an end. Mr. President, the October 7th attacks have triggered, arguably, a season of unprecedented suffering for Palestinians and Israelis alike, occasioning one of the deadliest days in Israel's history, and perhaps the deadliest period in Palestinian history. Guyana reiterates its condemnation of the October 7th attacks on Israel, as well as the disproportionate response by the Israeli Defense Force and the collective punishment inflicted on Palestinians, which continues today, almost 2 years later. The urgency of a ceasefire and of the need for a resolution of the present crisis cannot be overstated. We support the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to that end. A comprehensive response is required that addresses all elements of the situation. Compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is central to an ultimate durable solution. In this context, Guyana reiterates its unequivocal call for the unconditional release of the remaining hostages, in keeping with resolutions adopted by this Council, as well as its condemnation of the continued captivity of Israeli and other nationals in Gaza. The taking of hostages is a violation of international law, as stipulated in Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and should not be used as a bargaining chip to extract concessions. Perpetrators of this crime must, therefore, be held accountable. Additionally, Guyana calls for the prompt removal by Israel of ongoing restrictions on and impediments to the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale throughout Gaza, which have led to famine, disease, and death throughout Gaza. This Council should not countenance the denial of critical relief for human suffering under any pretext. It would be an abomination for the international community to continue to allow innocent people, least of all innocent children, to starve while in the sight of food. This Council has a duty to act urgently and collectively to bring this war to an end and to hold all parties accountable for violations that have ensued. Further, the ongoing displacement of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the occupied West Bank, must also be urgently addressed, in recognition of the inalienable rights of Palestinians to a homeland and of the imperatives of a just and lasting peace, and having regard to relevant decisions of the International Court of Justice. The international community should spare no effort to safeguard the prospects of a viable two-state solution, as mandated by the relevant United Nations resolutions, including an end to the occupation of Palestinian lands. The two-state solution remains the essential core of a just and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians and the broader Middle East. Mr. President, in closing, Guyana underscores that collective political will makes all the difference. Hence, at this nadir of the war in Gaza, as we witness the worst of inhumanity inflicted on Gazans, we, this Council, must muster the collective political will to act decisively, comprehensively, and effectively. We must begin with a demand for immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, for an end to the violence in the occupied West Bank, for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, for an end to the humanitarian siege in Gaza, for the release of all Palestinians arbitrarily detained in Israel, and action to bring about a just, permanent, and comprehensive resolution of the Palestinian question. This is the only way to ensure true peace and security for Israel and for all its neighbors. I thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Panama. Excellencies, colleagues, Panama would like to thank Mr. Miroslav Jenča, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, for his briefing. We reiterate our support for the work carried out by United Nations agencies within their serious limitations in an extremely challenging environment in Gaza. We welcome the presence of His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, as well as the representative of the Observer State of Palestine and the representative of Argentina, who honor us today with their participation. Panama extends special recognition to Mr. Eli David, the brother of Eviatar David, one of the hostages still held in captivity, who also honors us today with his presence. We value his bravery in raising his voice on behalf of his family and on behalf of so many others who continue to live in the anguish of waiting for their loved ones. To you and to all of the families of the hostages, Panama conveys its solidarity and respect. Panama has repeatedly expressed its deep concern over the catastrophic situation faced by the entire suffering population currently in the Gaza Strip. The sad reality endured by the hostages since the inhumane attacks on the 7th of October, of which it is estimated that at least 50 individuals remain in captivity, and around 20 of whom are believed to be alive, continues after 669 days still in the hands of Hamas. This constitutes an extreme manifestation of deliberate cruelty, which we have strongly condemned in this chamber and which we today condemn once again. The actions of Hamas towards the hostages, including the deprivation of food, prolonged isolation, the sadistic use of these as instruments of pressure and propaganda, and even the forced dissemination of videos, amount to a calculated attempt to break their will and to intimidate. They represent a violation of international humanitarian law. The recent harrowing images of Rom Braslavsky and Eviatar David are not merely reflections of individual tragedy. They are irrefutable evidence of the degrading, cruel and intolerable treatment to which Hamas has subjected all hostages for nearly 2 years, evoking painful memories of a history that should never have been repeated. Panama once again demands the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages. The suffering of the kidnapped hostages coexists with the daily tragedy of the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza. All individuals in the Strip are bearing the consequences of Hamas's extremist and deliberately cruel actions, having chosen to inflict pain rather than seek solutions. Gaza's future should be free from Hamas and its extremist actions. Millions of Palestinian civilians, mainly women, children, and the elderly, are facing acute food insecurity, thirst, disease, and forced displacement. Panama is not indifferent to this prolonged suffering, which represents a lamentable manifestation of dehumanization. We recognize the fortitude with which so many people have endured amidst destruction and despair, clinging to the remnants of humanity in an environment that no human being should have to endure. In the face of an unprecedented, man-made humanitarian tragedy, alleviating the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza has become an urgent moral duty that calls upon us all equally. We urge that vital resources should reach those who need them most. Therefore, Panama insists that every humanitarian effort must be made to complement and strengthen existing humanitarian mechanisms. The United Nations agencies operating on the ground alongside other humanitarian partners, represent an essential resource in the international response. Excellencies, colleagues, the days during which the truce, albeit fragile, was in effect, demonstrated that it is possible to make progress both in terms of humanitarian assistance and in the return of those who were deprived of their liberty. That brief respite reminded us that there is still some room for humanity. In this regard, Panama reiterates its urgent call for the re-establishment of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, so as to halt the human suffering faced by all, to facilitate the sustained, unrestricted and adequate entry of vital humanitarian aid, and to ensure the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas, whose acts of cruelty and drama have escalated with the treatment inflicted upon hostages Braslovsky and David. It's time to give restraint a chance, to allow for dialogue, and to uphold human dignity as a fundamental principle of coexistence upon which peace is built. Thank you very much.
Vuelvo a asumir.
I resume my functions as President of the Council. And I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and our warm congratulations to Panama on assuming the presidency of the Security Council. Mr. President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Yansha for his briefing, and I acknowledge the testimony of Eli David and the distressing, unacceptable video of his brother digging his own grave. We reject all inhumane and degrading treatment against anyone, especially persons held in captivity. From day one, calls for a ceasefire have been launched by the Palestinian people. In Gaza, and the families of hostages echoed across the world. Both were actually aware that this war would mean more death and agony for their loved ones. And I'm grateful for all of my colleagues, members of the Security Council, who have stressed the need for an immediate, continuous ceasefire. It saves lives. It releases hostages and Palestinian prisoners. It saves lives. It opens the doors and the crossings for humanitarian assistance. Stop the starvation of our people. It allows for the reconstruction of Gaza. It gives peace a possible chance. It gives all of us hope. I am very grateful for all of you who have stressed on these fundamental principles, and it is in your hands, since you are entrusted by the Charter of the UN to maintain international peace and security, to succeed in implementing your resolutions, and above all, to succeed in beginning with having an immediate ceasefire. Our call remains unchanged nearly 670 days later. End this Israeli war of massacres and starvation against our people. Release the hostages and prisoners. Enable immediate, unimpeded humanitarian aid to Gaza, including by the UN humanitarian system, including UNRWA, and secure full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza so that the Palestinian government can assume sole governance and security responsibilities with regional and international support, and we can begin immediately the recovery and reconstruction process based on the internationally endorsed Arab OIC plan and move towards finally ending this illegal occupation and achieving a just peace. Yet, in direct contradiction with the calls of Israeli hostages' families and by hundreds of former Israeli military leaders, what is Israel's answer to this worldwide call? Let's occupy all of Gaza. Let's annex Palestinian land. Let's displace the Palestinian people. Mr. President, the Israeli representative sent a letter calling on the Security Council to address violations of international law that need to be condemned. Speaking of abhorrent massacres of innocent civilians, of people being starved, tortured, and treated inhumanely, of how they appear emaciated, victims of starvation and abuse, not once realizing how much this description matches his own government's actions against an entire civilian population, the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. And he concluded his letter saying, and I quote, "One must wonder who is really being starved in Gaza," end of quotation. A despicable denial of what is evident for all the world to see, and trying once again to use the plight of Israelis held captive to cover his government's crimes or to justify them. Mr. President, Israel is demanding the world to take a stance against starvation when it is actually starving an entire civilian population, when it is shooting at them while they seek water and food, with the most severe effects on the most vulnerable, with infants and children dying, and with those surviving facing untold pain and trauma. It is demanding that the world take a stance against conditions of captivity of Israelis, when it is holding 2 million people captive under its deadly siege, when 76 Palestinian prisoners have died under torture or starving or due to medical neglect in the last 20 months alone, when there are videos of Israeli jailers raping, beating, and humiliating Palestinian prisoners, when the world has seen the images of hundreds of Palestinians arrested, men and boys, placed almost naked on trucks and taken away, several of them having disappeared since, when 10,000 Palestinians languish in Israeli jails, thousands of them under administrative detention, the most arbitrary form of detention, when hundreds of our children remain detained, when Israel has held prisoners over 1 million Palestinians since the onset of the occupation 58 years ago, when it has held the remains of Palestinians for years and decades. Mr. President, the killing of civilians is unacceptable in all circumstances. Let me repeat. The killing of civilians, all civilians, is unacceptable in all circumstances. The killing of children is unacceptable in all circumstances. We should not tolerate harming or killing a single child, regardless of what nationality or faith they adhere to. Those who need to ask what is the nationality or faith of the perpetrator and of the victim to decide if you are outraged or not should go check their humanity. Torture and ill treatment of those held captive are unacceptable under any circumstances. It cannot be justified in some cases and condemned in others. Israel says The videos of Ron and Abiyatar are unacceptable means of pressure, and they are. Just as when it has abducted thousands of civilians as bargaining chips, and when it is starving millions of civilians as a method of pressure, as its leaders have confessed before finding a new narrative given the international outcry. Mr. President, when Israel says this is a war of civilization against barbarism, it means that its barbaric acts have to be condoned because the perpetrators are Israelis and the victims are Palestinians. It does not even see the irony of it, resorting to such images that have been used and abused by colonial powers who claimed to represent civilization against barbarism to justify their atrocities. That is why Israel's foreign minister fails to grasp how his moral lessons to the rest of the world, scolding his closest allies, explaining that they should act according to his own very peculiar view of the law and humanity, sound totally tone deaf, are a source of worldwide contempt for him and his government. But as we reject selective outrage, we should not practice it ourselves. We oppose and reject all attacks against civilians, whether Palestinians or Israelis. There is nothing that justifies harming civilians or those no longer taking part in hostilities. You cannot justify it by calling them terrorists, and you cannot justify it by saying they are occupiers. The rules of international law must be upheld by all and for all to preserve our shared humanity. Mr. President, allow me to address the Israeli people. Your government wants you to believe that the whole world is conspiring against you, that the Palestinian people are terrorists, that the UN is filled with terrorists and terrorist supporters, that your closest allies are your enemies. This most radical Israeli government and its foreign minister are calling for, and I quote, de-radicalization, end of quotation, of the Palestinian society as a whole, calling them, and I quote, human animals, and quote, children of darkness. They want you to believe that your survival depends on your ability to continuously wage wars, including against a defenseless civilian population, half of whom are children in their erasure. 1 million Palestinian children in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli people need to decide if this is what they want their government and military doing. These atrocities that the whole world is watching and that your government is hoping you will filter out, deny, or justify. In the midst of this genocide, we are telling you, you choose peace and appeal to you. We choose peace and appeal to you to do the same. We do it for our children and our people. You should do it for your children and your loved ones. Enough bloodshed, enough wars, enough suffering, enough occupation. Enough bloodshed, enough wars, enough suffering, enough occupation. We are clear. What Israel did before the 7th of October cannot justify harming Israeli civilians on the 7th of October. And what Hamas did on the 7th of October cannot justify harming Palestinian civilians ever since. There is no justification for the killing of over 60,000 Palestinians including nearly 20,000 children, the maiming of 200,000 Palestinians, the forced displacement and starvation of 2 million Palestinians, and the total destruction of Gaza. As there is no justification for the killing of more than 1,000 Palestinians in the West Bank in attacks by Israeli occupation forces and Israeli settler terrorists, or for the forced displacement of 40,000 Palestinians and destructions of their homes and refugee camps. The Israeli government is promising you that the solution is more occupation, more oppression, more displacement, more colonization, more killing, a recipe that has failed for 8 decades. Do not believe them. Do not believe them. If not for the Palestinian people's sake, for your own. If not in the name of humanity, in the name of self-preservation. The solution is ending this illegal occupation and ending this disastrous conflict. It is the realization of the independence and sovereignty of the Palestinian state, not its destruction. It is the fulfillment of our rights, not their continued denial. It is respect for international law, not its trampling. It is the implementation of the two-state solution, not a one-state reality with Palestinians condemned to genocide, ethnic cleansing, or apartheid. Mr. President, the international conference co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France and attended by around 185 states with the active participation of 120 of them, has charted an irreversible path to peace. In the midst of all these tragedies and the pain that we all endured, the international conference sent a clear message. There is an alternative way. There is an alternative way. All of you who participated in the conference and deliberated the outcome document and the annex, you made a loud and clear statement. There is an alternative way. There is a possibility of peace. Palestinians are not destined to forever endure occupation, displacement, and dispossession. And Palestinians and Israelis are not doomed to be at eternal war. By ending complicity and advancing compliance, by ending impunity, upholding accountability, by breaking the cycle of violence instead of fueling it, by rejecting violence instead of justifying them, by implementing the two-state solution instead of watching it to be destroyed, are the only alternative. Perpetual conflict is the only alternative is perpetual conflict. The conference identified the required actions by the parties and the states around the world in line with international law, the relevant UN resolutions and the ICJ 2024 landmark advisory opinion to achieve just and lasting peace that will lead to regional integration and security. Palestine endorsed the international conference declaration and annex, while Israel boycotted it. Mr. President, there are only two parties who link the latest wave of recognition of the State of Palestine to the 7th of October, against facts and reason. The Israeli government, in order to deter Western governments from such recognition, and Hamas in order to take credit for it. The reality is that more countries are recognizing the state of Palestine in support of its enduring commitment to liberation through peaceful means. As reaffirmed yet again in President Abbas' letter to President Macron and Crown Prince bin Salman in support of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, in support of the two-state solution that requires an independent and sovereign Palestinian state, and yes, also in response to Israel's attempts to destroy that state through the destruction of Gaza and the colonization of the West Bank, through the forced transfer of our people and the annexation of our land. Such recognition is thus in support of our rights and of peace. I repeat, our rights, the Palestinian rights and of peace, of an independent Palestine living side by side in peace and security with Israel based on the relevant UN resolutions. But since this Israeli government does not want peace, opposes a Palestinian state and the two-state solution, its opposition to such recognition is expected, and using argument such that supporting the two-state solution is supporting terror is also expected, regardless how absurd such a claim is. Peace starts with ending the war in Gaza. Let me repeat, peace starts with ending the war in Gaza. Peace will prevail once Palestinian rights are fulfilled and the Palestinian state is independent. We are ready to work with the US administration, Saudi Arabia, which showed leadership for Palestinian rights and peace, France, which made the right, courageous decision to recognize the state of Palestine, and all countries who wish to see freedom, justice, and peace prevail to finally achieve what some want us to believe is impossible. Peace in the Middle East, it's not impossible. We have to work for it. It is the only alternative to war, to destruction, to hostages, to prisoners, to pain, to death, to starvation. Which one is nicer? Peace is much nicer than war and destruction. Peace saves lives, release hostages, release prisoners, give our children and their children hope. Peace is what the world wants. Peace is the business of the Security Council to make sure that the maintenance of international peace and security. That is the alternative. For those who think there is no alternative, no, war is not the alternative. Peace is the alternative. A peace for all peoples and all states. A peace that can unleash the unbelievable potential of this region. A peace that saves lives today and achieves shared peace, security, and prosperity tomorrow. The time we waste is measured in human lives, and we are out of time. This Council and the international community as a whole have a duty to act, and to act now. Not a single minute more should be wasted. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Israel, His Excellency Mr. Gideon Saar. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We heard the heartbreaking testimony of Eli, brother of the hostage Eviatar David, starved by Hamas. I want to thank the US and other countries for answering our call. Thank you for convening this urgent and important meeting of the UN Security Council. But we also heard here so many lies. I cannot refer to them all, but it was really funny to hear Russian Federation representative, after 3 years and a half of a brutal invasion and brutal war in Ukraine and bombardments on civilian population in Kiev and other places, speaking here the way he spoke. I also heard the Palestinian representative. I must say the Palestinians learned propaganda from you, from the Soviet era, and you were good teachers. The Palestinians invented terrorism as a way to promote their means, and it includes all Palestinian fractions. And until this very day, the Palestinian Authority continued to pay salaries to terrorists and terrorist families accordingly to the crime the terrorists committed. And this is how they encourage terrorism until this very day. You spoke about peace. From 1947, you had countless opportunities to reach peace. You rejected them all. I come here today as the Foreign Minister of the State of Israel, the sovereign state of the Jewish people, fighting for its existence for almost 2 years on 7 different fronts. I'm here today because our hostages are still there, starved, tortured by Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the dungeons of Gaza. On October 7th, Hamas invaded, with no reason, into Israel. It committed evil crimes like the Nazis and ISIS did. They murdered and raped women, killed children in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children. They beheaded people, burned whole families alive, took 251 hostages into cruel captivity. 50 of them are still there, starved and tortured. I want to read from the Dina Project report. This report describes Hamas' sickening sexual crimes and atrocities committed on October 7th. And since then, bodies were found with objects inserted into their private parts. Bodies of naked women were found cuffed onto trees. Bodies were found with signs of genital mutilation. Most of the sexually assaulted women were among the 1,166 murdered of that day. After they were raped, they were murdered. They are forever silenced. But sexual violence continued for those taken in captivity. Amit Susana was released from Hamas' cruel captivity. She described bravely how she was forced at gunpoint to commit a sexual act on her capture. This is the pure evil that Israel faces. Hamas crimes are still ongoing. This past weekend, the whole world witnessed the cruel starvation of Eviatar David and Ron Braslavsky, tortured at the hands of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The world saw their terrible condition, bones standing out in their skin like living skeletons, looking death in their eye. Eviatar was forced to dig his own grave. You just heard his brother, Eli. Hamas and Islamic Jihad used the starvation and torture of hostages as evil tools. It's part of a deliberate and well-planned sadistic propaganda campaign. Its goals: 1, psychological terror. 2, an attempt to create a link between our starved hostages and their blood libel against Israel. But it's a campaign of lies. Israel facilitated huge amounts of aid into Gaza since the beginning of the war. In an unprecedented way in the history of wars. And by the way, the quantities are growing every day, if you follow that. Yet is still accused of starvation. But the truth must be told. Hamas sadistically starves our hostages while the terrorists enjoy meat, fish, and vegetables. And we saw the brother of Eviatar demonstrated that with the photo of the well-fed terrorist with Eviatar in his terrible condition. And you all saw the thick, meaty arm of the well-fed terrorist next to Eviatar, the living skeleton forced to dig his own grave. We facilitating huge amounts of aid into Gaza. No other country acts this way in war, on such a large scale, under such difficult circumstances. But Hamas loots the aid and uses it as a financial tool. We hadn't heard a word about that from the Palestinian representative. The distorted Hamas terrorists cruelly decide if and what the hostages will eat, mainly what they will not eat. Eviatar spoke of entire days when he did not eat at all. Our sick and starved hostages still have not seen representatives of the Red Cross until today, despite this being explicitly agreed upon in the hostage deal in November 2023. The medicine they desperately need to survive has not reached them. While the terrorists, the murderers being held in Israeli prisons, receive medical care and nutrition, Hamas and Islamic Jihad torture our hostages. Terror states and organizations kidnapping civilians is not just our problem. But Hamas did it on a huge scale on October 7th. These terror states and organizations do so in order to ensure their own survival and interests. Terrorists inhumanely kidnap innocent civilians as tools to achieve their goals. In the case of Hamas, they try to force upon us their conditions remaining in power in Gaza. And don't illude yourself. They don't care that someone else will take responsibility on civilian issues, taking care of the ruins they left behind in Gaza. They want to stay the strongest military force to continue their war against Israel and its civilians. This dangerous phenomenon could happen tomorrow anywhere in the world. The world must put an end to the kidnapping of civilians. The international community must take it not worthwhile for the terrorists. Today it's Israel, tomorrow it's you. The world has been turned upside down. While Hamas runs its propaganda machine, a huge part of the international media is both ignoring the truth and buying its lies. I read the New York Times the day after Hamas released the distorted video of Eviatar David. I looked, but could not find Eviatar on the front page. And then I couldn't find his picture in all of the paper. I call on the international media. Put Eviatar and Rome front and center. Is this not newsworthy? We are witnessing an upside-down world. We are witnessing the twisted anti-Israeli agenda of so much of the global media. They shift the responsibility from the kidnappers and rapists to the attacked country. They shift the blame from terrorists to the victims. Instead of standing by Israel, you are blaming the victims of an attack from 7 different fronts. And I ask here at the United Nations Security Council, do you know what Secretary General Gutierrez tweeted after the horrible images of Eviatar and Rome were released? Not a word. Deafening silence. Yet we all see his endless and obsessive tweets against Israel, time and again. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing today is the rise of psychotic anti-Semitism around the world, flamed by modern blood libels like darkest days in history. Jews are hunted around the world simply because they are Jews. In Melbourne, in Amsterdam, in Paris. But it is not the only war on earth, but it's the only case. People are being hunted everywhere because of their nationality. Do you know of another nation fighting for its life and suffering around the world from hostility and violence? We are living in an upside-down world, a world in which Israel is put on a bench of the accused while it fights for its survival. There is a name for it. It's called anti-Semitism. 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism is having its golden age once again. There are countries that acted, even in this building, to pressure Israel instead of Hamas during sensitive days in the negotiations. They directly contributed to the assassination of the chances to reach a hostage deal and ceasefire. They prolonged this war. This is what they did. So now let us ask the simplest questions. Who initiated the war on October 7th? Who is responsible for its continuation, for the endless suffering? There is only one clear answer: Hamas. Hamas invaded Israel and committed the October 7 atrocities. Hamas still refuses to release the starving hostages from its dungeons. Hamas still refuses to lay down its arms. The call on Hamas to release our hostages must be front and center on the world stage. It must not stop until they are all come home. Mr. President, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of our hostages. We call on the UN Security Council to finally condemn Hamas for its evil crimes, to hold it responsible, and to demand the immediate release of all our hostages. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank His Excellency Minister Saar for the statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina. You have the floor. Good afternoon to you all. Greetings to all of our colleagues and also to Mr. Miroslav Jenča, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Gideon Saar. Allow me also, Mr. President, to express my country's congratulations to Panama for taking up the Council's presidency for the month of August. We wish you every success in such a lofty role. Mr. President, my delegation requested to take the floor today before this Council to clearly and firmly demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas. The Republic of Argentina has always condemned terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, and we do so not only due to our profound moral conviction, but also due to our own painful experience of having been victims of 2 attacks that shook our people. the 1992 attack on the Israeli embassy and the 1994 attack on the Amir headquarters. We know the harm that terrorism wreaks, and it is marked in our national memory. The heinous attack on the 7th of October in Israel was not just another incident, it was an expression of planned cruelty, an act of terrorism of unprecedented brutality, which claimed the lives of Argentine nationals and saw the kidnapping of more than 20 Argentinians, including many children, such as Kfir Bibas, who was just 9 months old and who was then massacred in the tunnels in Gaza. We continue to demand the unconditional and immediate return of the 4 Argentinians still in captivity, Eitan Horn, Ariel Cunio, David Cunio, and the body of Lior Rudev, as well as all of the hostages still held by the terrorist organization Hamas. Mr. President, the situation of the hostages is essentially a humanitarian question. It is unacceptable that they remain deprived of their freedom. They have now spent 669 days in conditions that we've seen reflected in videos that have been recently circulated, pawns in a game of perverse media terrorism, the only aim of which is to continue sowing anguish among the victims of the hostages, as we have heard today from Eli David today. What we've seen over these 20 months through images and testimonies are acts of torture. There's no possible justification for such barbarity and anti-Semitism. The silence and indifference are not an option. The international community cannot allow horror to become normalized, nor for those who are responsible to go unpunished. The Argentine demand for the release of the hostages remains as strong as it was at the outset of the terrorist attack. Our commitment is unwavering to the families of those who have lost their lives, to those who have managed to return, and to those who remain in the hands of Hamas. We will not cease in speaking out until all of the hostages have been returned home. Thank you very much.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Argentina for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.